Stakeholder theory is an idea about how business really works. It says that for any business to be successful, it has to create value for customers, suppliers, employees, communities, and financiers, shareholders, banks, and others, the people with the money. It says that you can't look at any one of those stakes, or stakeholders if you like, in isolation. Their interest has to go together. And the job of a manager or an entrepreneur is to figure out how the interests of customers, suppliers, communities, employees, and financiers go in the same direction. Now, think about how important each of these groups is for a business to be successful. Think about a business that's lost its edge with its customers, that has products and services that its customers don't want as much, or that they don't want at all. That's a business in decline. Think about a business who manages suppliers in a way that the suppliers don't make them better. The suppliers just take orders and sell stuff, but the suppliers aren't trying to make a business more innovative, more creative. That's a business that's in a holding pattern and probably in decline. Think about a business whose employees don't want to be there every day, who aren't using 100% of their effort and their energy and their creativity to make the business better. That's a business in decline. Think about a business that's not a good citizen in the community, that routinely ignores or violates local custom and law, that doesn't pay attention to the quality of life in the community, doesn't pay attention to issues of corporate responsibility, of sustainability, of its effects on civil society. That's a business that's soon to be regulated into decline. And think about a business that doesn't create value, doesn't create profits for its financiers, its shareholders, banks, and others. That's a business in decline. So stakeholder theory is the idea that each one of these groups is important to the success of a business, and figuring out where their interests go in the same direction is what the managerial task and the entrepreneurial task is all about. Stakeholder theory says if you just focus on financiers, you miss what makes capitalism tick. What makes capitalism tick is that shareholders and financiers, customers, suppliers, employees, communities can together create something that no one of them can create alone. I've defined stakeholders as any group or individual that can affect or be affected by a company's purpose. Now, that definition is sometimes controversial. Some people say it lets everybody in because, after all, can't activist groups, web-based NGOs, a small group on the other side of the world, can't they affect a company? And the answer to that is yes. There's some truth in this criticism. That's a very wide definition of stakeholders. It comes from the idea that stakeholder theory is about business. It's about strategy. And it says if a group can affect you, then you need to deal with it. Well, another way to think about stakeholders is just to define them as those groups that can almost always affect or be affected by. So you start from the idea that if you look at practice, if you look at a lot of businesses over time and in lots of settings, really it's customers, suppliers, employees, communities, and the people with the money, financiers. That those are the primary or definitional stakeholders. And other stakeholders, government, media, NGOs, interest groups, environmentalists, critics, however you want to put those groups are important because they can affect how you create value for customers, suppliers, employees, communities, and the people with the money. I don't think definitions are very important. I think what's important is understanding how the value creation process works in a business. And in business A, in the automobile industry in India, the value creation process may be different than in business B, a web-based startup in Silicon Valley. So the point of stakeholder theory is to say, let's try and understand who those groups are that are important to the value creation process. We have this idea in business that, you know, when you tell somebody you teach business ethics, they say, well, that's an oxymoron. Two words, you put them together, they're a contradiction. And business and ethics just don't go together. If you start thinking about stakeholders, you have to re-examine that idea, because stakeholders turn out to be not products, not accounts, not assets, not liabilities. They turn out to be living, breathing human beings. And because stakeholders are living, breathing human beings, they're not just some role, they're actual people. It's not customers, it's customers with names and faces. And you don't just provide them with products. Your products and services come with a promise. Once you begin to think about stakeholders, the language of ethics kind of creeps in. And in a way, this is intentional, because the point of stakeholder theory, or managing for stakeholders as I like to call it, is that it's a way to think about business that puts business and ethics together. Business ethics shouldn't be an oxymoron. It should be two words that are redundant to each other. When we think about business, we ought to think about, well, what are the effects of this business on those that are outside it? Customers, suppliers, employees, communities, and the people with the money. Thinking about stakeholders is thinking about business, and thinking about stakeholders is thinking about ethics. It comes to the same thing. So that's why it's important to think about stakeholders having names and faces and families, because they're human beings just like you and I. If we treat them as faceless entities, as roles, as assets, as receivers of products and services, we miss the fundamentally human connection that capitalism allows us to provide. I'm always amused that I get a lot of credit for having developed the stakeholder idea, and I really didn't. I wrote a book in the early 1980s that tried to show who did develop the idea. As near as I could tell, it was developed at the Stanford Research Institute by a number of people as a way to categorize the business environment that was there. Then it got developed by people at Wharton, Russell Aikoff and Eric Trist. And in 1984, I wrote this book that just tried to catalog kind of where we were and what might happen if you began to take the idea seriously. Well, then a lot of people started to work on the idea. And so stakeholder theory today is a really multifaceted approach by literally hundreds of scholars who take pieces of the idea and develop it in lots of different ways. I think what's one of the things that's interesting about that, I thought that the stakeholder idea was primarily an idea about business strategy. But the people who really took this idea up and developed it were people in ethics and people who did corporate social responsibility. Today it's been kind of rediscovered in business strategy, and I think that's probably a good thing. But what has been missing for 30 years is the sense of integration. The sense that managing for stakeholders is about what business is and what capitalism is. And yeah, it's about strategy. And yes, it's about ethics. And yes, it's about corporate responsibility. And yes, it's about civil society. But it's mostly about all of that and how you put those things together and literally tell a new story about capitalism. Capitalism is about how we create value for stakeholders. What makes capitalism work is our desire to create value for each other, not our desire to compete. Capitalism is the greatest system of social collaboration we've ever invented. Competition's important, but it's a second-order property. It's about collaboration. It's about how we cooperate together to create value for each other. So the history of the stakeholder idea is, I think, a history of trying to understand the business environment and make sense of it, to making sense of it in a way that says, you know, we really have to rethink the basics of what capitalism can be.